Hey everyone, welcome back to Studio Upstart. In the last episode, we covered the fundamentals of startup studios. And just to avoid confusion, I'll repeat that startup studios are also called venture builders, and these entities create startups one right after the other in parallel simultaneously. Now, they do this using one core team of talented individuals and a model for repeat success. But how exactly does each startup studio make that model their own? In today's episode, we're going to take a look behind the curtain at the business model of startup studios, and it turns out there are actually only 6 key elements of that business model, but they can be mixed in a variety of different ways to produce successful startup studios. So we'll cover each of these elements in detail. I'm Deanna. I'm completely obsessed with startups and the amazing things that go on behind the scenes to make them successful. This is Studio Upstart. Let's jump in. Business models are tricky to define, but easy to differentiate. For example, you may not know how to describe Amazon's business model or know the inner workings of Costco's business model, but you can say without a doubt that these two entities operate in fundamentally different ways. One sells online only, the other sells offline only. One sells individual items, the other sells items in bulk. People impulse shop on Amazon. People purpose shop at Costco. There are more specific differences, but for the most part, business models are pretty straightforward.
In an article published in the Harvard Business Review, writer Joan McGreta presents one definition of a business model. She says, a business model has 2 parts. Part 1 includes all the activities associated with making something, designing it, purchasing raw materials, manufacturing, and so on. Part 2 includes all the activities associated with selling something, finding and reaching customers, transacting a sale, distributing a product, or delivering the service. A new business model may turn on designing a new product for an unmet need or on a process innovation.
So essentially, a business model is a process for innovation and paying the bills. Startup studios are no different, and in true entrepreneurial fashion, they have gotten very creative with their take on business models. Each studio is unique in the way that they operate and the markets they reach, but for some, there are major differences, like studios focused on just a specific space rather than being open to a variety of industries. But other differences are minor, like whether they offer a specific amount of money per milestone or they limit the money funded to one main investment and the founders can kind of use it however they want.
In thinking about startup studio business models, I find it extremely helpful to use a lever system model. The categories used in this lever system model are borrowed from one of the most influential papers written on startup studios called Startup Studios, Innovating Innovation by Enhanced Ventures founding team members Albert Saline and Ritesh Tialani. Their paper breaks down the 6 elements that make up the formula of success for startup studios. These elements are the guild, the idea, the structure, the funding, the volume, and the focus. The guild encompasses all of the internal resources of a venture builder, including a strong core team of startup operators, financial capital, legal resources, space, connections, and infrastructure. With the idea, venture builders have options when it comes to where they get their ideas from. Some startup studios only work on ideas that are sourced from the internal team. Other studios are open to being pitched on ideas. This means an entrepreneur has an idea for a startup and brings it to the venture builder. If the internal team likes the idea and decides to test the idea, that founder is now involved with the venture builder as an entrepreneur. The structure of a startup studio depends on the ultimate goal of the studio. There is no right or wrong answer here. It's just that some venture builders decide to stop operations once the startup is launched, and others have the resources to invest in their ventures as separate entities. To be clear, there is a difference between the structure of a studio and the funding of a studio, but I've grouped them together for simplicity. All that's really important to note from a high-level perspective is that all startup studios fund their projects through the early stages, but some go seeking venture capital when the startup gets market traction, and others just continue to fund the startup themselves. The volume of startups that a studio takes on at any given time is dependent on the goals and resources of the studio. I would say out of all the elements of a startup studio business model, this is the one that fluctuates the most. Some studios, like Expa out of New York, work on 10 startups at a time. Other studios, like Pioneer Square Labs out of Seattle, operate 20 at a time. The focus of a startup studio can be categorized on a spectrum from super specialized to really general. As you can see in this graph, a studio that takes on startups in any sector is viewed as a generalist studio. Generalist studios might have a small degree of specialization if they work on startups within a certain industry, like health tech, for example, but they're generally open to working on any good idea. On the other end of the spectrum, there are studios that only develop a very specific type of company that only fits one segment. These are studios that focus on problems that require a high degree of industry expertise, connections, and resources. Both models are equally valid as they both provide valuable innovation to the startup ecosystem.
So as you can tell, there is a lot of nuance that goes into startup studio business models, and each of the 6 elements represents an opportunity for studios to differentiate themselves from one another, and also to make their studio more attractive to potential future founders. Now, let's take a look at how these 6 elements work together in different ways to produce variations of startup studios across the globe.
This is the lever system I was talking about earlier. It's a design I've come up with to visually represent the degrees of difference between startup studios. As you can see, the 6 business model elements are listed on the left, and the degrees to which they can transform are listed beside them. For example, Human Ventures out of New York is a generalized startup studio that works as a holding company and VC firm. They self-finance for a bit and then take on outside funding. They work on an average number of startups at any given time. This is essentially their business model. On the other hand, a startup studio like 500 Labs in San Francisco takes on only a few projects a year, but supports these ventures with an incredible amount of resources. They almost always fund their projects using venture capital dollars rather than internal investment, and they're only open to taking ideas from the internal venture builder team. This is their business model.
So it's important to note that these business models I outlined are subjective. This is all based on my own research of venture builders, and I might be slightly off on some of the pieces of the spectrum, but this model isn't meant to be an absolute measure. It's supposed to be a helpful visual that will give you an understanding of the distinct differences between venture builders. So I've linked to a template for this model in the description below. Feel free to download it and edit it and work with it to assess startup studios on your own. If you're a startup studio owner, I would be incredibly interested on your feedback on what you think the levers and spectrums of your business model are. I think the more that we as a society and community create a shared language about venture builders and startup studios, the easier it will be for people to get involved. So that's it for me today, guys. I hope you learned something new, and if you did, please hit the subscribe button so you can be notified when I release the next video. This is Studio Upstart. I am Deanna. Thanks for watching.